again, Jeff Hansen, the founding member of Breakwater Capital Group, and Madeline, my partner, will co-host today with a special guest who we'll introduce more formally in a minute. Again, thanks for giving up time. I think the webinar gods haven't been at our back. Every time we've had a session this year, it seems like it's been a gorgeous day. So people have, maybe had an excuse to play hooky. But again, thanks for the time. I figure what better way to spend a Wednesday than dive in and really get into depth on the debt ceiling. So we're going to spend the next hour. No, I'm just joking. No one wants to talk about the debt ceiling anymore. We've heard enough. But again, as part of our process, and as Maddie and I talked about, 2023's plans, we wanted to have an engaging webinar series where it wasn't all about asset allocation and valuations and the stock market. We have those quarterly, but outside of that, we're trying to just bring in some insightful content and if we can have a subject matter expert like we have today, that just makes for a better experience. So we welcome your participation. Hopefully you take away from the discussion some really key learnings, and we look forward to similar events. For those of you who were reading quickly, it's not David Crosby. Crosby, Stills, Nash fans probably might be a little bit disappointed, but I think you'll be really excited to hear from Daniel Crosby. So Maddie, I'll let you more formally introduce our esteemed guest today. And Daniel, thank you so much for the time.
We are so excited to have Dr. Daniel Crosby be joining us today from Atlanta. He attended Brigham Young and Emory University, is now a psychologist and behavioral finance expert who helps organizations understand the intersections of mind, market, and meaning. He is also a New York Times bestselling author of The Laws of Wealth and the Behavioral Investor, and host of the Standard Deviations podcast. He constructed the Irrationality Index, a sentiment measure that gauges greed and fear in the marketplace from month to month. And his ideas have appeared in the Huffington Post and Risk Management magazine, as well as his monthly column, wealthmanagement.com, and Investment Ideas. Daniel was named one of the 12 thinkers to watch by Monster.com and a financial blogger you should be reading by AARP. So needless to say, we are absolutely thrilled to have him join us, and we'll let him introduce himself a little bit better here.
No, you both did a great job. I can't improve on that much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. Like she said, I've spent my career kind of studying the psychology of money and all the weird, wacky things we do with money, and it's a great pleasure to be here with everyone today to share some of those insights.
That's great.
So
go ahead, Maddie, please.
Yeah, so we thought we'd start today. We have some questions prepared for Daniel to go through, the survey that we had sent out, a few questions on his book, and then a few questions on behavioral finance in general. Anything that you wanted to add to that, Jeff?
No, that's it. I would just say, like, if we could try to keep our questions towards the end, I think, in my experience, being able to kind of rapid fire through those is good. It allows us to kind of stay on topic and make good use of Daniel's time today. So again, if it's critically important, you feel like you want to ask the question right at the moment, it's fine. We have the chat. Feel free to type in your question there, but we'd generally like to hold the question and answer to the end. For those of you who did participate in the survey in advance of the discussion, awesome, it's great. For those who didn't, please feel free to take a look. It's interesting. I suspect that maybe if you did it today and do it 6 months from now, your results might change, although I tend to suspect that probably not. We're wired one way, and it's hard to change those things. But again, Daniel, I'll let you kind of give us a little of the backstory of the creating of that and maybe some of the stuff that the clients will get from that.
Yeah, it was actually really kind of fun and organic how that BFI 20 survey came to be. We set out trying to solve a very specific problem. So I'll share some stats that may shock some of the listeners. Financial disagreements, the #1 cause of divorce and separation in Canada and the US. 12% of couples have never had a single conversation about money, and 67% of couples think their partner overspends in some significant way. And I could sort of go on and on. We did a survey at Orion where it found that people a large number of people were keeping financial secrets from their partners, and that by and large, people considered financial secrecy to be on par with cheating, with marital infidelity. And so there's a lot of baggage around love and money. And so really I set out when I was creating this survey, we surveyed hundreds of people in Canada and the US. And I really set out when I was creating this survey to, quite frankly, see what couples fought about when they fought about money. And a couple of 5 different categories were sort of identified in that process. But what was neat was we set out to sort of study one thing and we found another. So, Jeff, you talked about having read the works of Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize winning economist, in our pre-chat. And Thaler has this great quote. He says, when you study memory, when you want to study memory, you don't study memory, you study forgetting. And that's kind of what we did when we were creating this survey. We ended up finding out a lot about people's financial values broadly, because what happens is when one person's value system comes and collides up against another person's value system, there can be conflict. But it actually sort of highlighted, by studying these arguments, it sort of highlighted the most common financial values for us, and there were 5. And so now, whether it's with a couple or an individual, we can give them this survey that takes just under 3 minutes on average to take, and find out a ton about their financial values.
And what were those 5 values that you saw?
Yeah, so the first, unsurprisingly, was communication, right? And it's sort of, think about these things along a continuum. You've got direct and indirect communicators. The second one was worry. Some people worry a lot about money, some not so much. The third is my favorite, if I may. The third is my favorite, and the one that really resonated with my own experience. The third is what we call purpose. And this is where is the purpose of money to enjoy today or secure tomorrow? The third one was use. This was sort of an individualistic versus collectivistic use case. We found there were cultural and gender differences around use that weren't present with some of the others. In general, we found that white men were the most likely to answer that money was sort of for individual use, and that non-white, non-Western respondents were more likely to have a collectivistic, communalistic orientation around money, and that women had a more community-focused, other-focused orientation around money. And then the fifth one was around importance, right? So how central is money to your concept of self? And for some people, being wealthy, having things, having a good net worth was very central to how they think about themselves and their personality. And for other people, it did not register at all. And so again, you sort of see, I'll expound upon this a bit. I'll sort of tell on myself here. For me, the purpose one, this is where there was the greatest disagreement, was whether money should be used to enjoy today or secure tomorrow. And when I present that to you and I say, well, which one is right? Which one is the correct answer? They're both important, right? I mean, they're both important, and that's true of each of these things. There's no right answers. There's no identified patient, or, this member of the spousal partnership is right and this one's wrong. But anything taken to an extreme can become problematic. So for me, my purpose is as a saver, right? My purpose is that security function. I really want to secure that tomorrow, and I save very aggressively. My wife is the same way. But, my dad, who is my financial advisor, who has sort of had to counsel me that, like, look, he did the same thing when he was a younger man, right? He was this aggressive saver, always putting off a vacation, was always going to do it later when he had money. Well, now he has money and my mom is in poor health and they can't do all the things they dreamt of doing. And so it really is all about balance with these 5. There's no right answers. There's no wrong answers. It's really about understanding, meeting in the middle, and working towards that synthesis and that mutual understanding.
It's funny as you enjoy today, secure tomorrow, because these are conversations I have with clients all the time. And what is, tomorrow eventually becomes today. And I see a lot of clients just continue to in the cycle of, well, hey, here I'm 50, again, so I still can appreciate the enjoy today, but I'm definitely still worried about secure tomorrow because I'm still working, I want to be able to retire. So you get to 60 and it's still the same mentality. And they get 70 and you get 80. And then at what point is you've secured tomorrow, it's time to enjoy. I think I see a lot of clients wrestle with that. So is there a way where I mean, look, there's some that's our job in terms of doing the math, but is there a way to help people get over that hump of saying, at one point, saving was a means to an end, then it became an end in and of itself. Let's get it back to being a means to an end. Have you seen anything where that's been helpful to kind of rearrange people's thinking?
Yeah, there's no easy formulas or cutoffs, and I think this is a lot of the value of an advisor. I think the way we try to position even the reporting of it, it's helpful to know where you sit relative to the rest of the world. So for me, my security function is, all the way to the end. I'm a freak about saving, and I'm very reticent to spend money, and my wife is the same way. And so sort of left to our own devices, we could leave a lot of joy on the table. And so there's no there's no formula, there's no magic words you can say, but understanding that about ourselves has made us do things like this summer, we're going to spend a month on the beach in California, right? We got a place in California, and it's after we set aggressive savings goals, we hit them. And now we're going to go live in Southern California for a month in July because Atlanta's miserable in July. And so it's stuff like that I think candidly we would not have done if we had not had this sort of moment of moment of reflection and moment of understanding where we sit relative to the rest of the world. And I think a lot of times we think in binaries, right? Okay, these are the years of my life where I'm going to go, sock it away. And then my dad's story, sometimes that tomorrow comes and it's not as you'd envisioned it. And so I think, there's certainly seasons that are more saving seasons and certainly seasons that are more spending seasons. But I do think you want to work towards relative moderation all along the way, just because nothing in life is promised.
Sure.
And do you find that when people have that, financial plan in place, that gives them more ease, if they are those consistent savers?
Yeah, oh, I mean, definitely. And I mean, when it comes to what an advisor sort of would prefer, I think, that's easier to coach, I think, than the opposite sometimes. But I think it helps to know where you sit, because one of the things that we learn about money is that I grew up the son of a financial advisor in a very frugal household. My wife is the daughter of an accountant. And so it's you don't know what your worldview is like until it comes in contact with another person's worldview. Our attitudes about money are formed in very small groups, and we can tend to be kind of insular about these things. And so taking an assessment like this, where you see against a nationally normed sample, sort of where your attitudes and your values sit, I think is instructive, because we just don't have exposure to many other people's attitudes about money. And a lot of times our first exposure to that is when we move in with someone or get serious with a romantic partner. And if they grew up different than we did, then those worlds can collide.
I was laughing with Jeff. My husband and I are dramatically different. And so, we're not two peas in a pod when it comes to money. One of your questions was, do you use it to seize the day? And as my husband's taking the survey right next to me, he's like, absolutely. I'm like, oh, this is making me nauseous.
Yeah.
But, when you have people that are dramatically different than their spouse or partner, how do you reconcile that while still planning together to achieve, common goals?
I love this question, because one of the things that people erroneously assume about this assessment is that similarity is good and that divergence is bad. And that's just not the case. And so one of the things that we did with the assessment, there's effectively two things we have to guard against. When two people in a relationship are highly aligned, there's a risk of blind spot. Okay, so I'll use me and my wife, who are big savers, big on the security function. Our blind spot is we get to retirement with lots of money in the bank, grown up kids that we didn't seize the moment with, right? We missed opportunities, we missed time, and there's no getting that time back. But because we both operate sort of with the same worldview, we're not calling each other on that. We're not questioning that. We're not fighting about it. Like, it feels great for both of us to save like crazy and to say no to everything because we're like that. And so there's this blind spot that we hope the assessment will bring to light for people like me and my partner, right? For you and your partner, right? If you're divergent on this one function, the danger there is conflict, right? Because there's judgment around, like you said, you feel nauseated when you look at your husband responding to this thing because it's so different than you. That the danger there is not a blind spot like it is with me and my wife. The danger is conflict. And so in the assessment report, we try and give some language around sort of mutual respect and managing conflict. And one of the things that I think is so powerful here, Carl Jung has this quote that I'll try and get right, but it's something to the effect of, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life and you will call it fate. And so when we haven't yet sort of called out these differences between one partner and another, we can be judgmental about it. He might think, well, Maddie's just being uptight, and you might think of him, well, he's being frivolous, or this sort of thing. And we can become judgmental about it because we don't understand the genesis of these differences. But when we can bring them to light in a safe setting and have a conversation about them, we can see that it's just the way we were raised, it's the way we're wired, and it's something that we want to meet in the middle on, no matter where we sit. The last thing I'll say about this, there's actually fascinating research on psychological differences in work settings. So if we think about diversity, not in the way that it's commonly talked about, but in terms of like psychological diversity, psychologically diverse teams, people with all different sort of backgrounds and personality traits, they fight more, they take longer to make decisions, but they make better decisions and they make more money. So there's a lot of value in this divergence. There's a lot of value in being different than your partner. You just have to learn to have those conversations in a constructive way. And if you can, it's probably better, candidly, than being just alike.
Interesting. And speaking of that conversation, because I think it's hard for people to have with their partners, we see that a lot, people to have with their families, we see that even more. And we know that, a lack of financial literacy costs the average American $1,400 per year, which can add up very quickly. And your survey talks about how comfortable people feel discussing money in general, and with family. So we know that a lack of knowledge is costing people real money. Where, in all the research that you've done, where do you think this lack of knowledge comes from? Is it because we're truly just, not being educated about the right things, or is it really just that uncomfortable for people to talk about?
Yeah, there's a couple of places this comes from. One is just sort of prevailing cultural norms. The other is there's like no real sweet spot with money the way there is with other things. It's almost like you don't have enough or you have too much, and we have sort of judgmental assumptions about both sides of that equation. I think perhaps the biggest thing is that we've tied net worth to self-worth. And so people see, disclosure about money as a sort of indictment potentially of who they are as a person. And I think we have to break that tie before we can really get candid about money. But I'm gonna like share an unpopular, I get like tomatoes thrown at me every time I say this, but I'll say it here. I'm writing another book right now for some reason, and one of the things I like doing hard things that pay poorly, I guess. And so one of the things that I've found is I'm doing all this research on financial education, and it's really just not that effective, right? It's not that effective like in a high school setting, say, or in a college setting, because we find that people forget about 90% of what they learn in the first 3 days if it's not regularly implemented and applied, right? Like I took 4 years of French in high school, and I took my daughter to Paris recently and was useless. And I think that's kind of, I think we see a lot of that with respect to financial literacy too. So the thing that I would say is the behavioral research says that the most important type of financial literacy is something we call meta knowledge, which is effectively knowing enough to know where you're weak. So I don't know anything about cars, but I know enough about cars to know when I need help. And one of the things that's dangerous about people walking around with absolutely no financial education is that they don't even know how little they know. And so I think we need enough financial literacy to understand where we need to outsource and where we need to get help. But I'm not very optimistic on, the average person getting enough knowledge to kind of do it themselves.
Let me come over the top on that one. It's interesting because society as a whole, especially in the U.S., it's like an entrepreneurial culture, kind of do it yourself. Like, and so there's this psychological concept like the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is like I can watch something for 30 seconds and I've mastered it, right? And my father's an engineer. There's a famous concept. It's like measure twice, cut once.
Mhm.
Yet in the investing world, like no one seems to do that. I mean, I'm amazed how many people watch Jim Cramer and that 30 minutes they spent watching, Fast Money is enough to go ahead and allow them to build a portfolio. So, I think we're identifying this at maybe as a developmental opportunity for younger people, but I see this people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I'm not here to bash my clients who watch Jim Cramer or the financial media, but I just like, is there, I call it like self-sabotage. Are there things you can do, to help people so that they're not, overestimating their competency, especially in something so important when it comes to like, their finances, right? Like the mistake you make here is much different than making the HGTV mistake. Like I painted the color, a darker blue than the room should be, so the energy is not great in there. It's, hey, no, I bought this thing, it went down by 50%, and now I might have to work an extra year or two, right?
Yeah, so first of all, I got to take a small digression here to talk about, you mentioned Dunning-Kruger, which is one of my favorite psychological biases. So the genesis of Dunning-Kruger was a gentleman robbed a bank. Okay, this guy robbed a bank, and when they apprehended, excuse me, when they apprehended this very clumsy bank robber, he was covered in lemon juice. And so the cops are completely befuddled. And they're like, what? Like, buddy, what was the thought of covering yourself in lemon juice before you went to rob this bank? And he said, well, when I was a kid, I would make invisible ink with lemon juice and it would make the ink, the ink disappear. And so I thought that if I covered myself in lemon juice, I would be invisible. And so Dunning and Kruger, the researchers, heard about this and they went looking into it and they found this notion, right, that a lot of times the people who know the least are the least able to know how little they know, right? And so we have really talented people who are highly insecure, like people who are deeply trained in this stuff are very aware of all their shortcomings, but the people who aren't versed in it at all are quite competent. So the easiest way that I have found to kind of get people to cop to this is to have them reflect on their own poor financial decisions. Like think about a time in your life when you made a financial decision, what motivated it, what went wrong, and what was the fallout. Because overconfidence is hardwired into all of us. And there's a real evolutionary benefit to overconfidence. It's what helps get us out of bed in the morning. it elevates our mood. It leads us to talk to the good-looking person at the bar. It, leads us to start a business or whatever in spite of everything. So overconfidence really does a lot of good in the world and is highly adaptive, but it's not adaptive when it comes to markets. And so, I think we're going to talk about this later, but the rules of life and the rules of markets are so very different. And helping people understand that, I think, is one of the precursors to this, because overconfidence serves us really nicely in a lot of other contexts.
And you
Super.
talk about that, yeah, a lot in your book, Daniel. I think you give some really good examples of how the rules of the market and sort of the rules of life are so different. Can you expand upon that? Can you give us a few examples?
Yeah, I call it Wall Street Bizarro World in one of my books. And if you think about a few things, if I said, what will you be doing 10 minutes from now, right? You could tell me with relative certainty exactly what you're going to be doing 10 minutes from now. But if I said, hey, Maddie, hey, Jeff, what are you going to be doing 10 years from now? You'd be like, I don't even, like, what? Like, I don't know where I'm going to be. I don't know where I'm going to live. I don't know if I'll be alive. Like, I don't know a thing about 10 years from now. Markets are the exact opposite, right? The short term is effectively just noise, but the long term, we can say with a lot of consistency what long term returns are going to look like. That's one example. You think about something like activity levels. In 19 different countries where this has been studied, the more people trade, the more people look at their portfolios, the more they mess with their portfolios, the worse they do. You can't say that about almost any other endeavor, right? I mean, if you want to get smarter, you read more books. Like if you want to get stronger, you lift more weights. If you want to get fitter, you run more miles. And if you want more money, you do nothing, right? So like all these rules, right? Whether it's time, right? Whether it's activity. The last example I'll give is, your clients, if they did what you said and they stayed the course over the last long term, they beat 90+% of professional investors, right? Where else can the amateurs beat the pros so consistently? Where else can mom and pop from Wichita beat hedge fund managers on the regular through good behavior? You and I can't go play basketball better than LeBron James, but we can invest better than institutional money managers in some ways just by controlling our behavior. So the rules are all topsy-turvy. Other places, the present is more certain than the future. The opposite is true in markets. Other places, doing more gets you more, and markets doing more gets you less. And so you really have to understand that what got you here won't get you there. And the same things that made you a successful doctor, engineer, entrepreneur, it's a very different skill set than what it takes to be a good investor. And I think that's hard for people to understand sometimes.
And to expand upon that, because I think this is so interesting, we hear that people want to jump into the market after it's been on a bull run for 5 years, and then they want to get out of it when we've had, a year of volatility. And so, but at the same time, we still hear a lot, in the media about these sort of get rich quick schemes. So can you tell us why, so many investors, even though it, sort of never works, timing the market is a not a great idea. Can you tell us why investors are still so allured by those?
So the allure of a get rich quick scheme is a bit like the allure of a conspiracy theory or something like that, where it's like you have Gnostic knowledge, like you have not like you get something that other people don't get. And so it has sort of a two-part appeal. I mean, getting rich is its own reward, right? Like people are excited about getting rich quick all on its own. But when it has this sort of appeal of insider knowledge or having some sort of hack, that's a very powerful 1-2 punch. And again, like it's kind of miraculous to me that anyone anyone can do what we ask them to do. I think as financial professionals, everything we ask people to do is difficult. Like we as a human race are wired for immediacy. I mean, everything in us is wired for taking care of right now. And as financial professionals, we're saying, hey, take this money that you could spend on something cool today, stick it over here where you can't touch it. It's going to go up and down. It's going to lose value at times. And you just have to be okay with that. So, like, we're wired for immediacy, we're wired for certainty. And we ask people all day to deal with volatility, to deal with uncertainty, and to put off immediate gain for some hypothesized future gain. And it's really tough to do. So, understood in those terms, get rich quick schemes appeal to all of these sort of most basic human impulses and do so in a way that makes us feel special or enlightened. And it's a deeply compelling proposition that never works.
Yeah, it's saying like, the worst thing that happen is someone to get wealthy, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so um, just coming back to this concept of like, immediacy and whatnot, there's a great book by Robert Sapolsky of, why zebras don't get ulcers, right? Which is, very much kind of fixated on the idea that like in nature, stress is, a point in time, it's episodic. Whereas like for the investor community, like I get the sense that like we've embraced this notion of chronic stress, right? We're watching CNBC and it's never talking about like, positives for this week the debt ceiling, a month from now it'll be the Fed and so on and so forth. So like, are there speed bumps? Are there things that we can, as good investing hygiene, we could incorporate in our day outside of simply like, hey, let's not watch CNBC, which I think is advice that's great for everybody. We're not sponsored by, we're not, CNBC is not going to get ticked off because I don't think we're watching our show. But the idea is we all know, hey, eat better, exercise. The actual ideas, most people, I think, try to do that at least, right after the new year. But are there things that we could do as investors that would make us, better to handle that, episodic or chronic stress that doesn't have that short-term effect on our portfolio?
Yeah, I love the term that you use, this sort of like, I call it a media diet. You called it hygiene. So, again, a quick digression here. So I'm a clinical psychologist by education. Like I've spent my entire career in financial markets, but my PhD is in clinical psychology. And a lot of the work that I did in fulfillment of that degree was around helping women with eating disorders. And so when I started the work to help, to help young women with eating disorders, it surprised me that the first thing the clinic where I worked would do was educate these young women about the motives behind how beauty gets marketed to women. And so they would help them become informed consumers of marketing messages effectively and say, okay, this is airbrushing. Like this is why they're trying to make you feel ugly, so you buy something. And doing that helped them move through the world in a more informed way. Okay. The last time I was on a large cable financial news network that will remain unnamed, right? I was promoting one of my new books. I had an earpiece in my ear. And so you can hear what's going on TV. Like you can hear what's being said on the program, but there's also a director in your ear kind of counting you down and telling that you're about to go on. And she was counting me down and she's like 5, 4, 3. And I was wearing like a tweed jacket. I'm a psychologist. I was wearing a tweed jacket. I was wearing like tortoiseshell glasses and a bow tie. And she's like 5, 4, 3, 2. Don't be a nerd. Give me something good. 1, you're on. Now that hurt, tough but fair, right? No, tough but fair. But it's interesting to me that in that moment, the incentive was not give these people academically based, measured, prudent financial advice. It was don't be a nerd, give me something good. And when we look at the way that people process risk and reward, we know that people have 2.5 times the cognitive activation for bad news that they do for good news. We know that we can measure this idea that if it bleeds, it leads. We're 2.5 times more locked in on bad news than we are good news. And so, financial news media, which is just a business like any other business that wants eyeballs and to sell ads and to make money, which is fine, they know that fear mongering about the debt ceiling is going to do more than sharing some positive economic update, right? They know what sells. And so I think the first thing we have to do as part of this hygiene is just understand how the sausage gets made and become attuned to receiving these messages with a full understanding of the motives that drive that behavior. Other sort of speed bumps that I put in place, I tear up the vast majority of my statements that come to me. Like I just do. There is a direct relationship between how often someone looks at an online statement, especially, and how well they do. And it's inversely correlated. The more people look at it, the worse they do. That's just because of the way that markets work. Like if you look at your portfolio once a decade, I think there's one time in the last 100 years where you would have seen a loss. But if you look at it every day, there's going to be a loss in an all equity portfolio 40% of the time. And multiply that 40 times 2.5, because we know that it, the pain hurts 2.5 times as much, and 40 times 2.5 is 100, like, right? It feels like you're always in pain. And so understand how the sausage gets made, limit your exposure to any sort of fear mongering, and then go replace it with living a fruitful, engaged life that's focused on other stuff.
Good advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking of sort of how much the stock market moves, we know that, trading of the stock market doubles every 4 or 5 years, causing, holding periods for stocks to continue to decline, sort of in the same theme that you're discussing now. Are there certain things besides the ones that you just discussed to continue to think about the long-term outcomes rather than, today or tomorrow?
Yeah, so there's this idea in psychology known as the future self, right? So this is the idea that, there's I'm 43, there's an 83-year-old version of me that's going to want to do nice things and eat good food too, right? Like he's going to want to do all the same things that 43-year-old me likes to do. But when we look at the research around this, people tend to think of, and we can actually look at the brain scans of people who are imagining their future selves, and we think of our future selves in the same way that we think of a stranger. So, you think of your future self with the same amount of distance and sort of, this arm's length approach because it lacks vividness and it lacks salience. So one of the things that we know is that people were 70% more likely to reach a financial goal when they made their future self more salient. So what do I mean by that, right? The idea is, let's say someone wants, I don't know, $1 million, right? Like I want to have $1 million to retire. Okay, well, what are you going to do with your $1 million, right? A lot of people stop there. Okay, but like, what are you going to do with your $1 million? Well, I want to buy an A-frame cabin in the woods. Okay, where are the woods? Oh, the woods are in the Oregon coast. Okay, well, what's it going to smell like? Sort of so on and so forth. The more granular we can get about our future plans, and the more that we can tie these things to something that we love, the better able we are to get past this short-termism. A couple of quick studies on this. There was a piece of research out of Canada that I just loved because I'm a father of 3. It compared people in a control group, right? So people who got no intervention with people who looked at a picture of their children for 5 seconds before they made a financial decision. And the people who looked at a picture of their kids for 5 seconds before they made a decision saved twice as much as the control group, which is completely irrational, right? Like there's no reason why that should happen, except that it reminded them of their why. So casting a vivid, salient vision for the future is important. Tying your purchases and your decisions back to what matters most to you is so powerful. And in the great financial crisis, people who were in goals-based portfolios, like portfolios that are tied to something specific, a specific desire, they were 12 times less likely to bail out than those who were in a traditional portfolio. So this power of like bringing your personal life into the conversation, tying those decisions to the things that mean the world to you is powerful medicine.
So it's interesting, right? So I'm reflecting this as you're saying. So I'm in some sense browbeating investors who I see make the consistent mistakes over and over again. I think it's probably an opportunity to take a shot at the advisor community, and I mean that in a constructive sense. Do you see like what are because I know you talk to advisors all the time, Daniel. Like, what do you see the best advisors do when it comes to those relationships with clients?
Yeah, so I'll start with the relationship piece first, and then kind of get into some more meat and potato stuff. So again, going back to my days as a shrink, what some of my early research was on what's called the clinical outcomes literature, which basically says who gets better in therapy and who doesn't, and who listens to their therapist's advice and who doesn't. And the number one predictor of whether or not people got better in therapy was whether or not they liked their therapist. Okay, it wasn't years of education, it wasn't the school of thought or the specific interventions. That stuff was a wash. Like a bachelor's level psychologist was no different than a PhD level psychologist, which hurts me a bit. But the number one predictor was just like, was there rapport there? Did they like each other? And so Accenture came out with a study last year that looked at what do people look for in an advisor. And the number one answer in terms of that advisory relationship was someone who gets me. And that's why I love what you all are doing with this BFI 20 assessment, and you are placing a premium on understanding your clients, who they are, how they think, how they love, how they move through the world. All of that is materially impactful. So if you're not getting your clients and you're not spending the time and the resources to understand them, you're missing a valuable source of benefit. The other thing is I have sort of a three-part hierarchy, right? That we need to get right if we're going to serve clients maximally. The bottom base of it's education, again, right? This meta knowledge, knowing enough about how markets work that you can have reasonable expectations. Okay. Survey from a couple of months ago said the average investor thinks that they're going to get 17% annualized for the next 10 years, right? If you think that, you're gonna be disappointed. Like if you think that's how the world works, you're gonna be disappointed, and then you're gonna make a bad mistake, right? So education's the foundation. The second piece is the right environment, right? Which is the right media diet, the right asset allocation, so you can stay the course. Because as we've talked about a couple of times today, environment is a much better predictor of your eventual behavior than like your wishes or your, reliance on willpower. And then the third one is encouragement. And this is where the advisor kind of swoops in. Even the best educated person, even the person who's in the perfectly sort of titrated portfolio, is going to have moments of self-doubt. They're going to have moments of fear. They're going to have moments where they want to throw in the towel. And this is where the advisor calls on that relationship and is a steady hand for that person. Research out of Canada compared people who had a long-term relationship with an advisor, 15 years plus, to those who did it themselves. and they normalize that data across 50 different variables, like notably stuff like education levels and salary, right? So that they're comparing apples to apples. People who worked with an advisor had 2.7x, 2.7 times as much wealth as those who had gone it alone. And when you kind of drill down on what causes this vast difference in wealth outcomes, it's that advisor 3 or 4 times in that person's life said, hey, I'm not going to let you do that. I mean, it's like investing in the brother-in-law's business, selling everything in March of 2009, throwing in the towel during COVID. You get 3 or 4 of those big crossroads that the advisor's a steady hand for, and it makes a world of difference. So education, environment, and encouragement, I think, in addition to the relationship, are the big 3.
Thanks. That wasn't a plug for us as much as I wanted to make sure it felt like we were getting a balanced side, and not here to beat everybody up, but really well said. When you think about your relationship with your kids, with your wife, and I don't know how old your children are there things that like you might encourage for younger people, not so much in the literacy piece, but just in the sense of like getting exposure to concepts about not being not having everything that you I'll use a first example. My 4-year-old has kind of a expectation where everything's going to fall exactly into place based on his wishes, and so it's kind of like, how do you set people up for disappointment? Hopefully we learn that as investors, and hopefully sooner than better. I'm thinking, can I help a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 20-year-old? So let me let you answer the question. Hopefully you can deduce what the question was after I kind of meander through that.
Yeah, so helping just like some foundational money lessons for kids, I guess, is that the question? Yeah.
That
So
and just not everything's easy, right? With respect to
yeah,
investing.
yeah. So with the first part of the question, one thing that I really believe is that however you grow up, like whatever financial situation you find yourself in, or your kids find themselves in, that is your normal. And so, speaking strictly from averages, the kind of people who are on this call who are working with an advisor are going to be more financially successful than average, right? And so I think one of the things that we need to do is to expose our children to different ways of life and to help them understand how lucky they are, because they don't feel lucky, right? Because what they know is just normal. And so I think that's one of the things I feel very, very strongly about, is just helping them experience other ways of life, and get a greater perspective on what it takes to accumulate wealth and to be financially successful. To sort of the second half of your question, how do we help them understand that everything's not always easy? I think that you have to teach kids the value of a dollar, and this is something I'm struggling with myself, right? With my kids, I'm a big shoe guy. I love Nike, like I love Jordans and Air Maxes, and I collect shoes. And my kids, the other day, I was looking at some shoes, and they came down and they're like, well, Dad, how much are these? And I was like, well, they're $250. And my kid's like, oh, that's not bad at all. And I was like, no, that's terrible. Like, like, that's terrible. Your dad's a maniac. Like, what? No, that's terrible. And so like I had to help them, give them opportunities to work, understand what it takes to put together $250. And with all of my kids, I just have little paper accounts where just at a very basic level, help them understand that owning a stock is fractional ownership of a business, and that businesses' fortunes will come and go based on a variety of factors. So I just set up little paper trading accounts for my kids where they can pick names they know, Nike, Disney, that sort of thing, and then help them see that there's good money to be made, but also things can go the other way too. So I think, helping teach them the fundamentals of what a dollar's worth and investing, I think, is just a good start for kids.
Good stuff. Thanks.
Well, now I think is a good time to open it up for questions from the audience. We haven't had any come in yet, but would love to answer any. And I'm assuming, Daniel, that you'll be going to see Air soon then.
Yes, I just saw this morning, I just saw this morning that you can watch it on Amazon now,
Oh,
and
I did not
I
know
will
that.
actually be watching it this evening. Yes. Looks great.
Yeah, it does.
So, just for folks who want to explore a little bit more about the world of behavioral finance, I know again a plug here for the Laws of Wealth and the Behavioral Investor, two of your books. Are there things that you would say are approachable or worthwhile for people to kind of just spend a little more time on? Again, I think Kahneman's great, but it's very much a textbook read for a lot of folks, and you can even say the same thing at times with Thaler. So, obviously, again, we'll make sure we share your titles, but any really influential thinkers that you'd say, hey, if you're gonna spend some time outside of Daniel Crosby, people should read?
So of my books, they should definitely read The Laws of Wealth. That's the more accessible book for this crowd. The book The Behavior Gap by Carl Richards, I think a very accessible sort of primer on these sorts of ideas. And the book Nudge by Thaler and Cass Sunstein is one of the sort of seminal works, but it's a lot more reader friendly than say Thinking Fast and Slow. Thinking Fast and Slow had the Amazon through its Kindle app can monitor when people put books down, and Thinking Fast and Slow was the most put down book of all time because people would start it and just couldn't finish it. I love it, but it's very academic. So I think The Laws of Wealth, The Behavior Gap, and Nudge are a good place to start. My podcast Standard Deviations, we talk about these things. There's also one called Choice Hacking by a woman called Jen Kleinhens. She has one called Choice Hacking, which talks about the application of sort of behavioral economics principles in stores you shop in. Like, how does Target or Costco or Trader Joe's, use behavioral science in their appeals to you? And I think it's a powerful way to become an informed consumer. So that one's super easy listen and really fun.
Cool.
And we did have a question come in, as sort of in the same theme here, as you talk about, different books to read and podcasts to listen to. What about, the media? Is there, a specific one that you would recommend that isn't, necessarily fear mongering, so to speak?
Well, so you know, okay. I'll make a couple of comments here. One thing you want to do, I think, politically, we're at a time in our nation's history where we're more politically divided than we've ever been. At least save the Civil War, right? I mean, this is about as politically divided as we've ever been, and I think it's important that you seek out non-preferred data sources, right? I mean, we all kind of know the skew of the major news outlets. You probably have one that you sort of naturally go to because it most closely aligns with your own political perspectives. I certainly do, right? I would encourage you to seek out differing opinions, right? To flip to the other channel, to spend a minute there and just try and inform yourself a little bit. In terms of the financial news, I would read books over magazine articles, and I would listen to podcasts over watching the news. I would really try and get to evergreen first principles, right? Through some of the books that I talked about. The day-to-day financial news is cotton candy, right? You want some red meat. Like, if you want some red meat on investing, there's great books, some of which have been around 50 or 100 years, around the things about investing that have never changed and will never change. What to look for in a great company, right? Like, how to value a company. That stuff is evergreen. Whatever's going on with the debt ceiling or whatever the president's doing or what's happening overseas, I mean, it's literally of negative utility when it comes to you making decisions about your money. So I would seek out evergreen, enduring sources of deep content over anything kind of day to day, and be careful with my political news to sort of diversify my perspectives.
Great points there. I think that's really good place to end it. You know, I want to be really respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciated the discussion.
Yeah, Daniel, it's great. So for folks who joined us, we're again grateful for your time. This will be recorded or has been recorded. We'll be able to push this out. We'd encourage you to share with friends and family. Most importantly, take a look at Daniel's books, The Laws of Wealth. Again, he plugged here. We probably didn't do a good enough job of plugging it ourselves. So again, can't thank you enough, Daniel, for taking the time this afternoon.
No, my pleasure. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.